Welcome to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the podcast. I've been sort of a groupie of the Institute for Systems Biology and Dr. Lee Hood for years and years. The Institute for Systems Biology, for those that don't know, was started by Dr. Leroy Hood, a famed scientist and inventor, and a past winner of the National Medal of Science. I remember I felt like I was hit like lightning the first time I heard Dr. Hood say in a public talk, "We've come to the point in medicine where it's too complicated to practice medicine sort of between your ears. Yeah, there are simply too many details, facts to handle without some sort of computational technological support." And I really clearly remember feeling like just doing medicine sort of the old-fashioned way, ordering a couple labs and trying to cobble some meaning together by myself was like practicing medicine with a match on in a room instead of the lights on. And our guest today is a very special man. He's Dr. Nathan Price. He's the Associate Director of that institute, the Institute for Systems Biology, and he is co-founder of an award-winning new company called Arivale, A-R-I-V-L-E. It's Arivale. He was hired by Dr. Hood to be his Lieutenant General. Nathan's resume of accomplishments and achievements are, of course, too many to list here. But just trust me, he's a pretty serious dude. Hello, Nathan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Nate. Happy to be here.
Nathan, I remember when I met you and we were talking in Austin a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
You told me this sort of simple and succinct way that Dr. Hood hired you, something to the effect of an email or Nathan looks perfect or it looks great.
Yeah, the whole email. Yeah, I joke about that sometimes because I remember the entire email that I got back, which was because I had my advisor forward him all of my information. This was a long time ago, back when I first applied to work with him. And yeah, the whole email back just said, "Price looks great." That was it. And then we talked on the phone and I flew up and we had great conversations. And
memorable for me.
I never believed how many things we've done over the past dozen years.
Yeah, it's amazing, actually. And that's what I want to talk about. In my current position, Nathan and I have had reason to collaborate around areas where both of our groups are interested in. But to be clear, Nathan is not a medical doctor or someone that directly interacts with patients, though he is able to help thousands, potentially millions and more people doing what he does. He is a doctor essentially of computational biology, and he's a leader in a growing movement of individuals and scientists and organizations focused on something called scientific wellness. One of his current goals is early detection and intervention for Alzheimer's disease. And that's what brings us together. And Nathan really brings a unique perspective to the table around this idea. Nathan, first of all, can you give us sort of the boiled down introduction to the concept of scientific wellness and what exactly is computational biology and its role in medicine?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll start with scientific wellness. So scientific wellness is a area where rather than being reactive and waiting for disease and trying to react to disease, it's instead a focus to be proactive towards optimizing wellness and optimizing health. So it's related to the concepts of resiliency to disease and so forth. But scientific wellness, in essence, means that in today's world, we now have the power to harness so much more information about the body than before that we can start laying foundations with real scientific rigor around the concepts of quantifying wellness and quantifying some of the ways that we might go about enhancing health in the body. And so scientific wellness is a term we coined about this enterprise, this new field that we see emerging. So that's scientific wellness. Computational biology, there what we're talking about is building computational models to try to understand the vast amount of information that is available now, and this was accelerated in a major way by the Genome Project. So now we have whole genome sequences for a number of individuals. You can generate proteomes, right, the catalog of all the proteins in the body, metabolomes, the catalog of metabolites in the body, and so forth to various degrees of completeness. But all of that information is, just like you alluded to in your introduction, you can't really get your mind wrapped around all of it. And so computational biology is the way that we go about writing algorithms and building different sorts of computational methods to try to extract insight from all that data that we can now generate. And so those are two of the main things that we work on.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing, really. Just when I first sort of begin to try to understand the computing capacity and the amounts of data that you guys are generating, it's really unbelievable.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those kind of things. But the scale at which, and I guess it's interesting because I think in our era, it's almost become old hat to say that we'll have more information in the next 2 years than in all previous history. With the rise of the computing age, we're sort of used to those kind of statements. And yet those are in fact true when you quantify the amount of information that's available. And so when you apply that in biology and medicine, what's happening is just our ability to transition from ignorance to knowledge on so many different fronts in biology and medicine is accelerating. And that's very exciting. Medicine is a very tough field. I think you learn biology a lot faster than things translate into medicine on average, just because of its complexity and the obviously all the ethical issues and difficulties in terms of translating something and getting it to work for the first time in a person. And so, but the scale at which we should be able to do this going forward is pretty stunning. And you'll see a lot of grand pronouncements from a number of leading biologists and even some physicians now about sort of the scale of promise that's in front of us. It's pretty staggering.
Yeah, it is. And, one of the things that Institute for Systems Biology is known for is this 100K Wellness Project. You have spoken publicly about one particular participant who essentially, just to give our listeners a sense of what we're talking about in early detection of disease, and a gentleman who I think it was identified his inflammatory bowel disease on sort of this amount of information, the omics that you are collecting on people before he manifested symptoms sort of in real life or clinical symptoms. Can you just explain a little bit about the 100K Wellness Project and perhaps give us an example of how this has been already meaningful clinically?
Yeah, sure. So the 100K Wellness Project was a project that Lee Hood and I announced in several publications. And in essence, what it was, or what it is an approach where we set out to get 100,000 individuals. We wanted to do whole genome sequencing on all of them, and then multiple times per year, measure proteomes out of the blood, measure microbiomes for the gut, measure metabolomes out of the blood, wearable devices, clinical chemistries, this FITBITs, like all kinds of different things, where we would establish what we call dense dynamic personal data clouds. So the idea is that you get a huge amount of information about every individual. Now, what we want to do with that information, what we set out to do from the start, was to develop a data set that was dense enough in terms of the amount of information that was there, and dynamic in the sense that we were able to follow people longitudinally over time so that we could identify early warning signs for the major human diseases to give us the substrates on which to develop therapies by which we might predict them and prevent them. And so that's what we wanted to do. So it's really a big, grand vision. And so that is kind of the scale of data that we're talking about. We prototyped that in a study called the Pioneer 100, and that's going to be, which will be appearing in the literature fairly soon. But basically, that study was a pilot for this effort. And so we had some really interesting experiences that people had going through that, just to give one clinical example. So that was an Irb research study. And so we're not in the practice of medicine, as you alluded to before. So if things are medical, we refer them back to the healthcare providers. But basically, so just give one example. So one individual had come through, and he was having arthritic-like symptoms in his knees and ankles. And this was causing him to not be able to do some of the things that he most loved, like hiking with his family. And because of the nature of his position, he had concierge medicine on both coasts, My understanding is that they had given him some, drug for arthritis, but it didn't really work for him. And so in essence, he came into our study. And so what we did is we did this 360-degree view of him, made this huge number of measurements with computational infrastructure as well. And in his case, some very simple things popped out. One was that the ferritin levels in his blood were very high. Ferritin, for those that don't know, is essentially that's high iron in your blood, very high iron. Mm-hmm. And so we then looked at his genome, and in his genome, he had 2 copies of the gene that is the highest risk variant for hemochromatosis, which leads to these high ferritin levels. And so we referred him, to finish that out, one of the lesser known, the main kind of line of hemochromatosis can lead to a liver dysfunction and ultimately death. You can die from hemochromatosis. But one of the lesser known effects is that high amount of iron can catalyze a cartilage breakdown that manifests as these arthritic-like symptoms. And so in his case, we referred him back to the healthcare system, and he went and got treated for hemochromatosis. And for listeners who don't know what the treatment is, it turns out the treatment for hemochromatosis is very simple. Basically, you donate blood once a month. And so he started donating blood once a month. His ferritin levels normalized, and these arthritic-like symptoms, the problems that he was having, went away. And he was back to hiking and serving around. Now, that's an N of 1, right? So it's always hard to prove causality in an N of 1 case. But, that was something that manifested well for him, and it seems, an impact in his life. And what I like about that example is it demonstrates sort of what we want to do, which is because he was empowered by knowledge, he was able to make a very simple decision that eliminated a disease trajectory from his future. And just a teeny bit to that, there was also a second person in our study that also has the 2 genes encoding for hemochromatosis. But what's interesting is that for her, she's premenopause. And so for obvious reasons, this wouldn't have manifested. And so now what can be messaged to her is, okay, look, you've got the genes that confer this additional risk for hemochromatosis, may never manifest, but if it does, just donate blood once a month, monitor your ferritin, and no big deal. And that's a really big element for us because we're not in the business of trying to just give people risks for disease and then you can't do anything about it. What we want to do is give people actionable information. What can you learn about right now, today, that you can take action on so that you can improve your health right now, and actionable items so that you can avoid disease in the future. And there's a number of cases where that is already possible, diabetes being another clear case, and so forth.
Phenomenal. Really, it's fascinating. So you mentioned knowing somebody's entire genome, whether that's whole genome sequencing or a variety of technologies that you guys are using to understand an individual's genome. One of the things you've mentioned in the past, and I understand is quite important, is in order for you to study something, you need to have genome-wide association data available almost as a comparison or something. Can you explain why it's important to have good GWAS or genome-wide association studies and other things that you need as sort of reference points to look forward or look back or compare people, individuals against? Can you just speak to the importance of how that sort of factors into these development of these dense dynamic data clouds or personalized data clouds that you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we've been actually really happy with. So GWAS data, so these genome-wide association studies, what they basically give you is they tell you certain variants in the genome that are associated with a particular phenotype. It could be a disease risk, so like an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, or it could be related to a parameter that's in your blood, like an increased likelihood to have really high LDL cholesterol levels, for example.
So just to stop you there, just to get some background, because you got pretty technical pretty fast, which I appreciate, and most people are probably tracking with you. But for those that are not, a variant would just be something that could be common, but it's not the typical gene. It's not the common gene, correct?
That's right. Well, it's every gene can have a different sequence across a different individual. So for any particular location, there are what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or a SNP. Basically, that just means a one base pair difference. And a lot of the variants that we know a lot about in the scientific community come down to that. So it just means where one person has an A in a particular location, another person may have a G in that location, and so forth. And so, in essence, then, I'm just saying a certain form of a gene where we've characterized it. Usually, it's just a single point difference. Sometimes it's more than that, but a lot of times it's just a single point difference. Those have been categorized across lots of different individuals. So a variant, right, which is, say, different from the most common gene for a population, for either of those, though, you might say, what's that effect on a disease risk? And so when we compare to the reference, then you might have a variant that either increases your risk for a disease, and so it's a risk factor, or that decreases your risk for a disease, and so is called protective of that disease.
So it's like an ApoE4 gene.
Yeah, ApoE4 is a great example, which I imagine we'll talk about a little bit.
Yeah, we'll get more. I just want to follow up on this a little bit more because it's so interesting. It's emerging as such in my opinion, such an important piece of medicine that not everybody has access to and understanding. But so a gene, right? You know people's genes, but like you mentioned, consumer available, where you don't have to go through your doctor, options where people can go on the internet, 23andMe, for example, and get several SNPs. They can just list of their, like some of their genes. You guys are taking this to multiple levels further in the generation of these dense dynamic data clouds, where you are looking at then what are the products of the gene products, and et cetera, et cetera. Can you speak more to the sort of multiple layers and scales of data that you're collecting that you're finding important? You mentioned it before a little bit, but can you just embellish a little bit on that, please?
Yes. So I'll connect it back to where I was going with the GWAS. So you have these variants, but the key thing is that you're just measuring a signal about that gives for every person a score related to their likelihood of a different disease. Okay? And they're not perfect. There's noise in there. They're not destiny, but it's enriched. There's a signal there. Now, what you can do with these dense dynamic data clouds is you can actually take that GWAS disease risk score and use it itself sort of like a phenotype. And what I mean by that is that you can then analyze what are everything that is in, say, these dynamic measurements out of the blood, for example, that is correlated with that genetic risk. And so what you start to be able to do then is to identify what we call the manifestation of genetic risk in the body. So think about it this way. If a gene variant doesn't mean anything in a test tube, right? Your genes do something because they're in the context of the body. So when you have different genes, different variants of genes that confer increased risk for disease, then it stands to reason that they have to manifest somehow in the body. They're changing something. They're having an effect. And so by doing the dense dynamic data clouds, what we can do is identify where those genes are having an effect. And you can see it in dynamics. Now, what's really interesting is that you might then see differences in, for example, on average nutrient availability as a function of genotype. So that then has an effect on, well, what kind of dietary interventions or supplements or different kind of things like that might be useful. And what you're trying to do is you translate that I'm at high genetic risk for a disease. But then if you understand how it manifests, it might be that there are ways to intervene and lower that risk, right? And there's obvious cases that if you're at high risk for type 2 diabetes, for example, that's driven so much by environment, there are many, many choices that you can make to mitigate that risk. If you're at high genetic risk for hemochromatosis, as I mentioned earlier, well, donate blood. That is the mitigating factor for that risk because that high ferritin, that high iron is the manifestation in that case of that genetic risk. And you mitigate by getting rid of the iron or the ferritin in the blood by donating blood, you eliminate that trajectory. You see what I mean? So you're not just saying, hey, you're at high genetic risk, that's the end of the story. You're saying you have genetic risk, here's how it manifests, therefore take these steps to get rid of it. That's what we're trying to get to.
It's wonderful. On the level of Alzheimer's, this is a complicated problem that a lot of really smart people have been thinking about for a long time, and there's hundreds of drug trials that have been failures. And part of the interest right now, as you well know, in the research community is finding out about this earlier, whether that's 10, 5, 10 even perhaps 30 years. I was talking to a neuroimaging specialist earlier today. He was saying Alzheimer's is a congenital condition that starts at birth. And if you look at people's brains over time, you can, functional imaging, et cetera, you can really learn a lot. From your perspective, is there something uniquely challenging, complicated when it comes to Alzheimer's compared to diabetes, hemochromatosis? How do you parse through the Alzheimer's story? How is it different? Why is it important to you?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Alzheimer's, obviously a very complicated disease. As you've mentioned, a lot of people have worked on it for a long time, and it's been an extremely tough nut to crack. I work with a group at the NIH on, it's called the Accelerating Medicines Program for Alzheimer's disease, with a ton of really fantastic researchers, trying to mine huge amounts of data with a lot of the computational tools, trying to come up with potential targets and so forth. And it is extremely challenging on that front. There's no doubt about it. If you compare Alzheimer's, I'm going to take your two examples you threw out. If you compare Alzheimer's to hemochromatosis, big difference. Hemochromatosis is driven mostly by this single gene variant. We know how it manifests, which is this high ferritin, and there's a pretty simple intervention. Like, that's a much simpler story than Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's is much more complicated. In fact, and this is a viewpoint that I think is going to change, and I certainly hope so, but Alzheimer's is one of those variants where a lot of people, they don't want to actually know, if they have the genes that put them at enhanced risk for Alzheimer's. We can talk about that a little bit more later. I don't want to get into that too much yet. But
you could go into it if there's an important point that you're raising. I think.
Okay, well, I'll say just a little bit about that. Okay, I'll dive into the gene issue, and then I'm going to come back to the diabetes one, because I think that'll be the order that will make most sense here. So one of the issues is that it's almost reflexive in the genomics community to say something like, oh, but you wouldn't necessarily want to find out if you're ApoE4, which is the variant of ApoE that confers the highest risk for Alzheimer's disease. And it's followed almost invariably by, because there's nothing you can do about it.
Right, it's unethical. I've heard that so many times.
Yeah, okay, you and I are on the same page on that.
Yes.
Exactly, and it's repeated a lot.
Oh, that's the conventional lore. I mean, absolutely.
Exactly. And I think that it's really a misnomer. And we're, as you know, really keyed in on wanting to change that perspective and really wanting to provide evidence to people that you can make a difference. So the second disease you mentioned, diabetes, I think is really a critical one, because one of the things that people are learning is that Alzheimer's disease and diabetes, there's a lot of what's called comorbidity. In other words, they occur a lot in the same people. So there seems to be a connection between at least a subset of Alzheimer's disease and diabetes. Now, as soon as you say that, then what you know is that there's tons you can do to back out of type 2 diabetes, right? Lower your sugar intake, exercise more, all those kind of things that all people are aware of, all have a big and quite profound effect on your risk for diabetes.
Yeah.
Now, Alzheimer's disease is driven in part, it seems, because of these co-occurrences that you see, that it seems that Alzheimer's disease, at least some of it, has those elements to it as well. In other words, exercising, that, lowering the sugar intake, inflammation being low, there's all kinds of things that have an effect over your lifetime risk. And we think, and evidence is just sort of emerging on this, that, some of these are probably shared, there's some shared influences between what leads to diabetes and what leads to Alzheimer's. Some people have gotten quite provocative and started calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Right.
Not everyone's willing to go there yet. The evidence is still partial, but there's at least some validity to that type of mindset. And so we had a really interesting person up here at ISB recently, a physician named Dr. Rod Schenkel, and he gave a talk here, and it was really telling example. Again, it's just a small n. This is an n of 2 in this case, or the n of 1 or an n of 2, I guess, depending on your tune. But he had two twins, one of whom didn't want to know if they were ApoE4 positive, and one who did. And what was really interesting is that the one who did took a whole bunch of steps in terms of diet and exercise and trying to mitigate risk, and the other one really didn't. And lifestyle differences were pretty dramatic. And the one twin got Alzheimer's and died young. And the other twin, to this day, has not gotten Alzheimer's and has lived to a nice old age already. And
wow,
so,
please tell me that was the twin that was exercising and eating right, not the opposite.
Oh, yes. The twin that found out, that took steps. And again, it's a small n, so you can't read overly much into it, obviously. But yeah, he had pictures and all that kind of stuff. But they happened to come to his clinic the same time. They both came in 20 years ago. They made this different decision, and they had this very different outcome. And again, that's small n, so you want to see this in big populations. But I think the big population studies will show this as well. It's quite well understood that some of these basic things really do have an effect on delaying the onset of Alzheimer's. What is more controversial right now, although very promising, is whether or not you can take very proactive steps even to reverse the early stages. And you and I, both know well Dr. Dale Bredesen at UCLA, and the programs that they have taken and now have case studies, 120 different individuals claiming the ability to reverse early stage Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. And that is a dramatic claim, of course. So a lot of people, that kind of claim requires a lot of evidence. So a lot of people are diving in on this, including us, as you know, because we're still in the process of getting it all worked out. But we're going to be launching a clinical trial basically to test out that proposition, in a prospective group. And we are extremely excited about the prospects that a very integrative approach that, where you're doing as many things simultaneously as possible to try to push the body, a complex system in a particular direction, is going to pay off for people. And that can be systematized. So we are very intrigued by the work that Dr. Bredesen is doing and are looking very much to partner with him on testing this out in a rigorous way. So I think that there's some cause for hope there. What's been interesting, and you alluded before to the drug trials, right? And we've had something on the order of 270 failed drug trials. And I think that the odds that a single target drug is going to work for Alzheimer's, I personally believe that that's very low. Would love to see it happen. It would be spectacular. We are doing research. We're working with groups. We're trying to identify targets. We're happy to help people in those endeavors as much as we can. But I think a single target for such a complex disease is unlikely. So, what we have to stratify first Alzheimer's into its various types. We don't think that Alzheimer's is just one type of disease. And additionally, I think a very sort of comprehensive plan that incorporates things that are happening in lifestyle and diet with pharmaceuticals, with optimizing profiles of different molecules throughout the body, et cetera, is one approach that holds promise in these kind of complex diseases.
I just want to sort of kind of recap, because you said a lot and it's excellent, but what I'm hearing you say is that Alzheimer's really, from your view, is almost a syndrome of sorts, meaning it's a heterogeneous set of, or subset of, a variety of different things that are going on. And as of today, most of what we as clinicians could do is just sort of notice and database symptoms. Well, this one can't remember things that somebody told them 3 minutes ago. This one has trouble doing math. This one has trouble with word finding. This one's getting lost. Things like that, where we just sort of categorize things by deficiencies in the way people are able to think and by the deficiencies in their sort of domain of brain dysfunction. And what's fascinating to me about what you and Dr. Bredesen and others are now starting to do is generating huge amounts of information and then beginning to follow those things over time. So first of all, like we mentioned, you need a GWAS or genome-wide association study. And let's just give people a risk. Let's just determine a risk. Is there, when I'm 25, do I have to think about this? When I'm 45, do I have to think about this? When I'm 65 and I don't have any symptoms, except when I walk into a room, I'm not sure exactly sometimes why I walked in there. Is that normal? Well, we'd all like to know, do I really have to cut out on chocolate cake every night? Do I really have to exercise another 3 days? You know what I mean? We kind of know what we have to spend. And what's interesting to me about at least what I understand your role to be in a lot of this is, let's see how all of these sort of parameters or layers of information that we're collecting on people, let's see if they change, right? And that's, what you're doing with the 100,000 Wellness Project, and that's what you've already done with the Pioneer 100. And first let's just get the information, and then let's start to do interventions and see if or what if changes. I think it's very, very exciting.
Yeah, we're really excited about that. And I think there's a number of interesting implications here as well, because one is the nature of clinical trials in the era of personalized medicine or precision medicine, or, at one level, it can be fairly straightforward depending on what the intervention is. But some of these really personalized interventions, they start making, the way that clinical trials are thought about just a little bit different. And so what I mean by that is, we're very used to the gold standard being a randomized, blinded trial, right?
And just for everybody that doesn't understand what a randomized blinded trial is, that's where you take, say, 50 or 100 people, you put 50 people in one group, 50 people in another group, and a lot of them may not know which group they're in. They don't know if they're getting the actual pill or a placebo pill, and they're usually measuring one thing, one outcome, or testing one individual therapy. I don't know if that's where you're going with this.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's exactly right. And there are very good reasons that we want to do that. Statistically, it's a great way to go with the randomization, and blinded helps you to not have effects in terms of how people report, or it mitigates to some extent the placebo effect and things like that, which is what you're looking for. And so what's interesting, though, is that those paradigms and the way it's set up they've driven a mindset around a single intervention, which is why, when you try to set up a trial, everyone wants to say, okay, what's the pill? Because it's easy to give a randomized, blinded trial with a pill, because you can just give a person a pill that looks exactly the same, one of which has the drug in it, and the other is just a pill that's empty, basically.
Yeah.
So what I mean is that the high benefits of a randomized blinded trial, they'll have a little bit of a negative side effect in that we've gotten so focused around the pill that fits really nicely in there. If you talk about something like this integrative approach to treatment of Alzheimer's, where there's a huge amount of personal involvement and decisions and lifestyle, and there's a lot of optimization for blood parameters, and that's the kind of trial that's just interesting because it's very hard, if perhaps impossible, to blind something like that. In other words, if you're doing all those steps or not. It's becoming an integral part of your life. And so one of the really fascinating things going forward in this era of personalized medicine, where the treatment is tailored to every individual in pretty deep ways, is that we have to think a little bit differently about how we do these trials. And how do we generate meaningfully, statistically rigorous trials, that give us the answers that we need, but that are appropriate to the kinds of difficult, challenging issues that come up when you're doing these personalized therapies. And so in essence, you end up testing an approach to the disease, or an algorithm related to it, as opposed to a single intervention strategy. And that's, I think, really important for the future of personalized medicine that we want to get to.
Yeah, and it feels much more real world. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, much more real world. Well, I know that we've talked a little bit about all of the layers and levels of information, from the genomic information to the proteins to the metabolomics to some you're collecting stool and saliva on some people, and you're even starting to integrate probably historical information and sensor-based data, which is all totally fascinating. If we're sitting on a call generating hypotheses and just sort of thinking and talking from intuition, from what we think we know so far, what are some of the things that you think you might know from the trial that you guys are beginning to design in Alzheimer's?
Well, I think along the lines of some of what I've said, I don't, me, I'm a scientist, so
you're not a prophet. I know.
Before I say anything.
I know.
But basically, I think some of the things I outlined are really what I feel right now.
Yeah.
I think that there's enough evidence in the case studies that I really believe that we're going to see some good-sized effects in this integrated approach to Alzheimer's. So I'm quite optimistic that this is going to be a beneficial approach. So I do feel like that is likely to hold up, although, of course, we're launching the trial for the express purpose of of testing ourselves and seeing if we're wrong, right? So that's
absolutely.
that's what you do. But I do feel very optimistic on that front, and optimistic in a way that I haven't felt before in the treatment of that disease. I think this sort of integrative approach is what's really going to be necessary for that. I'm also very hopeful about the new approach to clinical trials, like I was mentioning.
Oh, yeah.
We are working hard to try to distill exactly what this is going to look like, but we're really excited about it. And the other element is that we're going to deploy, again, these dense dynamic personal data clouds across all these individuals that we'll be testing in the Alzheimer's trial. And that's going to give us unprecedented information and depth about many molecular systems that are being perturbed as a function of this disease, and hopefully as a function of the treatment. So we're going to be watching that very closely. So I think we'll learn a lot from those avenues. So on the whole, I think it's going to be, a remarkable journey. It will take a little while to get to the end, but I think there's a lot of hope on this front. And so there's been a lot of failed Alzheimer's trials.
No shortage of
this
failures.
is a very, very different approach. And so we're hopeful that it will pan out.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. A couple of other questions about seemingly unrelated topics, but I know we focused a lot on lifestyle interventions and potentially some pill medications, but some of the sort of your groups are involved in sort of the next generation sequencing and on sort of the data collection side. But in terms of treatment sides, do you see any role for, I know CRISPR technology? George Church, I think, is on your George Church at Harvard, I think, is on the board at Arivale Scientific Advisory Board, I believe. Whether it's with Alzheimer's or not, are you seeing with some of the information that you guys are collecting that there may or may not, or are you able to sort of speculate on the time frame or on the sort of immediate or near-term application of something like CRISPR to, as it relates to these sort of dense dynamic personal data clouds that you are learning and collecting on people, where they'd be able to effectively alter some of their own genetics for therapeutic benefit to get better, in other words?
Yes. So,
and maybe you could just say a word about, generally what CRISPR technology is.
Yeah. So CRISPR is an enormously exciting development in biology, one of the most exciting of my lifetime. And this is a technology essentially that makes it very easy to edit a gene. So we talked earlier about those genetic variants, right? And one variant might be associated with the disease and another not. What CRISPR does is, at least in a cell, you can swap out that so-called bad copy of a gene for the good copy of the gene. There's all kinds of downstream things. We could debate that for a whole hour. There's a lot of implications to that, but just very briefly. But basically, we now have unleashed, humanity now has the power to edit genes very easily, and you can do it across different species. We can do it for health. You can do it in stem cells. You can do it. We have crossed a threshold that will be, over the course of time, we'll find out was monumentally important. A lot of times in science, like a discovery, it takes a while before you realize how important it is. CRISPR, the first day everyone saw it, it was just like, oh, wow, the world just changed. It was just so obvious. And so CRISPR has enormous potential. So if you think about therapeutics, there are a number of really, really exciting areas that are in their infancy, but their power is going to be massive. And so it'll be a function of, going through the bumps and figuring this all out. But the ability to edit genes, because you can do things like pull out stem cells. And if you have accumulated mutations, for example, that might be precursors to cancers, you can just swap them out. So most cancers, for example, require an accumulation of on the order of like 6 different mutations into what are called oncogenes, cancer-forming genes. And that's not a perfect concept, but that's what's used. Mm-hmm. And so you could imagine pulling out certain stem cells, which is what regenerates all the other cells in your body. And if you see any of those, you can just fix them and then put them back. So, that's an interesting approach by far. Immunotherapies. So there's emerging ability to adapt the immune system to target different diseases. We're, in fact, with our collaborators in Florida, in early stages trying to work on something like that for Alzheimer's. But you've got an increasing ability to utilize the immune system and help it identify disease scenarios and go in and fix it. And coming back to cancer ends up being kind of the leading edge of a lot of treatments just because of the nature of it. It's a little bit more defined to attack a tumor. Alzheimer's is actually tougher, I think.
Yeah.
But basically, that's cancer immunotherapy is an extremely hot area. You can imagine, and George Church actually was very provocative on this because he came out and says he thinks we'll be able to reverse aging in 10 years. That's a lot faster than most people think. But it's because of looking at CRISPR and stem cells and technologies, and just the ability to do things that were impossible 5 years ago is staggering. And so it's very easy to think too small in this space.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we could have a whole other podcast on just the technology side. But
yeah, absolutely. But in terms of the role for something like the data that you're collecting, you would look at not just, so when you, let's say, change a gene piece or a gene sequence or a single nucleotide polymorphism or the variants that we were speaking about before, let's say from a higher risk to a lower risk, if I'm understanding in part what it is that you guys are doing at Institute for Systems Biology and Arivale, is that you can then sort of follow the pathway of what those changes, when you make those changes, what they're doing in the organism, in the person, as the human being as a whole. Correct? And we always want to know, are we doing more harm than good? Maybe we can solve Alzheimer's, but we're creating a whole nother set of problems. And do you guys have the ability to sort of look into the system and say, okay, one second, this may not be good. Let's think about it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, we certainly have some ability to do that. And that's one of the things I'm actually really excited about, with the approach that we're taking with these dense dynamic personal data clouds and so forth, which is, we're going to learn a lot about things like drug side effects, right? Because we'll see different systems that are affected that maybe weren't part of the measurements that were made, about the drug's primary target, things of that nature. We will be able to learn, and the way you counter that, I'm giving a talk, I'm going to a symposium for the Paul Allen Foundation coming up soon. And it's interesting because there's, I mentioned this co-occurrence of Alzheimer's and diabetes.
Yeah.
There's an anti-co-occurrence between Alzheimer's and cancer. And so people that get Alzheimer's disease are less likely to get cancer and vice versa. And that's not just a function of, just getting the disease. It's when you do all the statistical normalizations, that still holds up. So there are thought to be mechanisms such as related to reactive oxygen species and other elements where one, by being sort of overexcited on one front, pushes you towards one of the diseases, and being underexcited on that front tends you to push you toward the other disease. And so there's things like this too, where there's trade-offs. And you hit the nail on the head there for gene therapy in particular. So by taking a systems approach, we can help mitigate some of these things by understanding effects on multiple systems, but we're nowhere close to understanding how the whole body works, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the problem with early gene therapy. Gene therapy has the potential to be amazingly great to curing disease. But the problem is, especially early on while we're still learning, is that if you switch up those genes, that's a very dangerous thing to do because we don't know everything that all the genes do. And so what you find is there are very often unintended consequences, and unintended consequences are usually bad. And so you're exactly right. So that's where we're at. On this technology front, we have these amazing opportunities. We have, yes, an ability to monitor and be as careful as possible about, how do you go into those. But, and I should be clear here, when I'm saying we here, I'm kind of speaking generically for the field. I don't actually do gene therapy myself.
Right.
I should clarify that. But as the field, as science, as medicine pushes in that direction, just that balancing act is really important. The one thing I will say is that the dense dynamic personal data clouds and kind of taking this huge amount of information is super valuable for exactly what you talk about with these trade-offs in much safer domains than, say, gene therapy, like as people try to balance their nutrition, for example.
Sure.
And you switch things because, you might say, I'm low in omega-3s, I'm going to eat a lot of fish. But you eat a lot of fish, and fish has a lot of mercury in it, and pretty soon you have super elevated levels of mercury, right? And there's a certain dynamic to that as well that you can navigate with these kind of approaches. So there's a broad spectrum, but it does always come back to those kind of trade-offs.
That kind of led me to my last couple points I wanted to ask you about. In the now, because things like CRISPR and stem cells and the hardcore gene therapies that are evolving and emerging are not yet ready for prime time, but you, at least two of the organizations that you're working for as a part of, already have some things that are available to people. Can you tell us what is available and what is sort of actionable at this point in terms of the things your companies offer?
Just in general or for all?
In terms of if somebody says Alzheimer's or in general, and sort of in this sort of scientific wellness space.
Yeah, so scientific wellness is very actionable already. In fact, that was one of the things that we were most excited about from our Pioneer 100 project, was that basically absolutely everyone had something that was a benefit to them. So the areas that we focus on there, they're much more focused around diet, nutrition, specific recommendations around exercise, things of that nature. That's what happens in our spin-out company over at Arivale, for example, is much more focused on that in terms of scientific wellness. In Providence, we are certainly, there's a lot of things that you can do based on your genome now. It relates to guiding cancer therapies, which can be targeted based on genomic information. That's a big element, and that's kind of, again, cancer is kind of the leading adopters in this space for a variety of reasons, tumors being a little bit easier to study. Yes. People are very happy to give you their tumor, piece of their brain, not so much, right? You got to stay in and study afterwards, but the tumors you could get. So there's a number of elements like that where you can get a pretty major benefit today. And immunotherapies also are starting to be extremely useful as well. So I would say on those, but the major thing that we've operationalized recently was the spin out of Arivale, which brings scientific wellness to individual consumers if they are so inclined.
So just Google Arivale, Arivale, and it's fairly self-explanatory how to get in contact with the company and kind of what the options are. There's a sort of a menu there, as I recall.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for your time. It's wonderful to speak to you again.
Great talking to you too, Nate. Appreciate it.
All right, we'll catch up soon. So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comment section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.